With UFC 300 taking place this Saturday, I thought it would be interesting to look back at the other 100 cards, so UFC 100, UFC 200, and make kind of like a dream fight card with those three cards, so combining 100, 200, and 300. So we're going to have a 15 fight card here. I had a couple stipulations for this video. The main card is only going to be title fights, so there are more than 5 total title fights on these three cards, but we're only going to have title fights on the main card, and then I included the BMF title as like a title fight, and then same thing with an interim title fight that's going to make its way into this video. And then the only other stipulation was that if you fought on multiple cards, I couldn't have you like fight twice on this card. So for example, Brock Lesnar fought on UFC 100 and UFC 200. He's only going to appear in this video once, but let's just dive right into it. I think it's a fun activity, and it made a pretty stacked fight card here. So for the main event, I'm going to have Brock Lesnar taking on Frank Mir. This was for the heavyweight title at UFC 100, and I think you could definitely make the argument that both UFC 200 and 300 kind of blow 100 out of the water. Maybe not blow it out of the water, but I think you can make the argument that both 200 and 300 are stronger cards than UFC 100, but I think UFC 100 had the clear top main event. UFC 200's main event kind of fell apart. I think it was supposed to be John Jones, DC. Jones test positive. I think it was also rumored to be McGregor, Nate Diaz at one point. So the main event didn't really come through at 200. It ended up being Amanda Nunes, Miesha Tate. And then for 300, I think Jamal Hill, Alex Pereira is a great fight, but it still seems like fans were a little bit disappointed that it wasn't like Adesanya, maybe some crazy Brock Lesnar return, or like a Conor McGregor fight. But for UFC 100, this Brock Lesnar-Frank Mir fight was huge. This was the rematch. Frank Mir was Brock Lesnar's first fight in the UFC. They were rematching for the belt. Brock Lesnar was defending his heavyweight title, and Brock Lesnar at this point was just an absolute superstar. So I think this was the clear kind of main event here for this dream fight card. Now in the co-main, we're actually also going to be sticking with UFC 100. George St. Pierre taking on Thiago Alves. This was for the welterweight title, and while Thiago Alves may not be a huge name to some of the newer fans, he was definitely a worthy challenger for GSP, and I think GSP is definitely carrying this matchup, right? You had, arguably the greatest fighter of all time in his prime. This was in the middle of his streak where he was winning 33 straight rounds against the best competition in the welterweight division. So, Thiago Alves, not a massive name, but GSP being one of the best fighters of all time, I think it does, deserve a spot here in the co-main event. Now, the next fight on the main card is going to be Alex Pereira taking on Jamal Hill. Obviously, this is on UFC 300, the light heavyweight title fight. I just think Pereira's legacy is going to be so interesting when we look back on it. Everyone loves him right now. It's super fun, but he just really does have such a unique kind of run in the UFC. He hasn't had a ton of fights, but he's faced crazy tough competition, knockout wins over Israel Adesanya, Yuri Prochazka, Sean Strickland. All those dudes are champs. He has a decision win over another champ in Jan Blachowicz. He has the opportunity to pick up another champ win here going up against Jamal Hill. So Pereira's a stud. Both of these dudes are super dangerous. They can put each other's lights out at any point in the fight. It's a very fun fight on paper, and it definitely belongs here on the main card. After that, we're going to be going with Max Holloway taking on Justin Gaethje for the BMF title. I didn't feel like it was right to put the BMF title ahead of any of these real title shots. It will be before an interim title fight, so that's kind of where I compromised. But Max Holloway, Justin Gaethje stylistically is probably the most fun fight on this card. There's no way this fight is not going to turn out. Even if one of them gets finished early on, it's still going to be entertaining. If it goes long and it's a war, obviously that's going to be amazing for the fans. These are two of the most exciting fighters in UFC history. I don't think there's going to be any wrestling here. This is an absolute banger fight. Love the matchmaking here with Max Holloway taking on Justin Gaethje. And then the final fight on the main card, like I said, there are a couple title fights that didn't end up making the cut here because they would have to be on the main card. I went with Jose Aldo taking on Frankie Edgar. This was for the interim featherweight title. This was at UFC 200. It was after Jose Aldo's loss to Conor McGregor, when McGregor was kind of bouncing around, going up weight classes. They wanted to, get this interim featherweight title shot going. Obviously, Jose Aldo very deserving of that shot. Same thing with Frankie Edgar. It was a rematch. And since losing to Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar had won 5 straight fights against crazy high-level competition. Those 5 straight wins were against Charles Oliveira, BJ Penn, Cub Swanson, Uriah Faber, and Chad Mendes. So he was really just going through a murderer's row. definitely earn that interim title shot, and I think that's a great way to wrap up the main card here. Now, shifting over to the prelims, the featured prelim is going to be Daniel Cormier taking on Anderson Silva. This was at UFC 200. Anderson Silva stepped up like a BMF on short notice after John Jones tested positive. He was out of his prime at this point, which may kind of ding this matchup a little bit, but this matchup still featured two of the best fighters in MMA history. Anderson Silva, if you're not dinging him for the steroids or for testing positive, is a top 4 fighter of all time, no doubt. Daniel Cormier is in that 5, 6, 7, 8 area. So really 2 all-time greats squaring off. And shout out to Silva for taking this on short notice up a division at light heavyweight. Now, the next fight on the prelims is going to be Charles Oliveira taking on Arman Tsarukyan. So obviously here at UFC 300, you have an all-time great lightweight in Charles Oliveira taking on a potential future all-time great in Arman Tsarukyan. I think this matchup is super interesting stylistically. Both are dangerous on the feet. Both are dangerous on the ground, but for different reasons. Arman Tsarukyan, great control wrestler. Charles Oliveira obviously has a very slick submission game. So I really love this fight, and I think it's towards the top of the prelims when we combine all these matchups in terms of the non-title bouts. And then after that, we're sticking around on UFC 300 with Yuri Prochazka taking on Alexander Rakic. Yuri's one of the most exciting fighters of all time. This is a super high-level fight. Rakic is incredibly skilled, and I think the winner has a strong case for the title shot. So the stakes are there. It should be a fun fight, and it's going to be high-level. So I think that definitely belongs on the prelims. Then we're going to have Dan Henderson taking on Michael Bisping. We're going all the way back to UFC 100. This was when Dan Henderson landed his legendary H-bomb on Michael Bisping, knocked him out really badly, had a nasty follow-up shot on him. They would end up rematching 7 years later for the title. And most know about Michael Bisping's incredible career, his knockout win on short notice over Luke Rockhold to win the belt. Obviously, he's doing commentary, so he's definitely more involved with the current MMA fan base. But Dan Henderson is super underrated all time. He has wins over Fedor, Bisping, like I mentioned in this fight, Rich Franklin, Vanderlei Silva, Vitor Belfort, Shogun twice. So he has a very, very strong kind of resume there. And I do think this was just a very good fight between two very high-level guys here. And then the final fight on the prelims is going to be TJ Dillashaw taking on Rafael Assunção. So this was at UFC 200, and this was pretty much in the middle of Dillashaw's prime. This was right after he had a split decision loss to Dominic Cruz. A very, very close fight and kind of in between his 2 title reigns. So even though he wasn't the champ, this, still pretty much was prime TJ Dillashaw. Rafael Assunção was on a 7-fight win streak, and on that win streak included a win over TJ Dillashaw 3 years before. So this was pretty much a shot to get right back into that title picture. Just 2 very high-level bantamweights at that time. Dillashaw obviously was a champ. Assunção didn't get there in the UFC, but he was always right there as a top 5 bantamweight. Now, pivoting over into the early prelims, we're going to start off with Cain Velasquez taking on Travis Browne. This one was also on UFC 200. And this wasn't necessarily prime Cain Velasquez. He was just coming off of losing the belt to Verdum, but this would actually end up being his second to last fight. So just came off of losing the belt, picked up a win over Travis Browne, who was 9-3-1 in the UFC heading into this matchup. But then after it, injuries, the Francis Ngannou fight, he just wasn't able to get back to his prime. But Cain Velasquez, one of the best heavyweights of all time, right off a title loss, definitely had some high stakes there. Nice heavyweight matchup. Then we're going to be going with Davison Figueiredo taking on Cody Garbrandt. I'm not sure how competitive this fight is going to be, but you have 2 former champions, 2 guys with a whole lot of power. Both have pretty entertaining fight styles. I definitely think this belonged on the super card. Also at 300, Aljamain Sterling taking on Calvin Kattar. You have a former reigning champion in Aljo going up a weight class up to 145. Calvin Kattar's coming off of an injury, but is never in boring fights. And I just think this is a very interesting stylistic clash between these two. I could see Aljo going out there, landing some takedowns, taking the back, making it look impressive. And I could also see Calvin Kattar defending the takedowns, really beating Aljo up on the feet. I think there are definitely some question marks that we'll be very, interested to see if those get answered here at UFC 300 on Saturday. Again at 300, we have Holly Holm taking on Kayla Harrison, and I'm probably going to be higher on this fight than most people. I think this matchup's probably going to be one of those that ages well because you have Holly Holm, who's a former champ, has arguably the most memorable moment in women's MMA history with her, legendary knockout over Ronda Rousey, who was just massive at that time. And I think in the future, right, Kayla has the potential to be a dominant champion at the 135-pound division. If Amanda Nunes does not come back and Kayla can consistently make 135, I don't know if anyone's beaten her. And even if Nunes does come back, that's a fight I really, really want to see. So when we're looking back at this, right, it could be Kayla Harrison, multiple-time champ at 135, facing Holly Holm, who was the champ, had the legendary win over Ronda Rousey. So I do really like that fight. I'm very excited to see Kayla Harrison in the UFC. And then the final fight on this card, I would consider this like the Bo Nickel Cody Brundage of UFC 100. It's John Jones taking on Jake O'Brien. So obviously, Jake O'Brien isn't some sort of like elite UFC fighter. He's not like some name that everyone knows. I didn't even know he existed before I was kind of looking at these cards. But John Jones was 3-0 at the UFC at this time. And even though he wasn't prime John Jones, right? I'm not putting this on the main card or even the prelims. I feel like when you have a future top fighter of all time, early on a card, it was important to throw him on here. So I did put John Jones here as the curtain jerker. The first fight of the night, like I said, I think it's very reminiscent of Bo Nickel taking on Cody Brundage. Now, it wasn't on the main card of UFC 100 like they're doing with Bo Nickel, but still made it here to wrap up this fight card. So let me know what you guys think about this. Obviously a super, kind of fun exercise here. Were there any fights that I left off that you thought should have been on here? I think there are definitely some arguments for some getting on here. Maybe you prefer a different title fight, prelims, early prelims. Let me hear it down below. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.